Now, last time that I was with you, which is quite a little while ago, I know, and I gave a little talk, a story, about a man called George Bennet. Now, George Bennet was a man from Sheffield. He lived about 200 years ago, and I forgot to bring the little pictures that I had, I think, of him. So I've got here a little thing that shows you a monument to him in Sheffield. It's in the Sheffield General Cemetery. It's called the General Cemetery because when it was first established several hundred years ago, it was really only for dissenters, nonconformists. No Church of England people were allowed to be buried there. And the reason for this was that the Church of England cemeteries and churches were full up in their graveyards. And they said, we're not burying any more nonconformists in our church places. So that's why this cemetery was opened quite a long time ago. After some years, however, the Church of England cemeteries were so completely full, they didn't know where to bury their people either. So they came to the nonconformist place and said, please, can we bury our people in your place? And so they said, yeah, if you pay, of course, but you can't do it in the same area as where our people are. So they built a dividing wall, can you believe it, between the nonconformist bit and the Anglican bit. And also they had to build a church there for the Anglicans to replicate the fact that there was a nonconformist chapel. And both of those buildings still exist there to this day. The Anglican church is derelict, really, and nothing's happening with it at all, whereas the nonconformist chapel has been restored very recently, in fact, in the last 2 years. So that's the General Cemetery. But in the General Cemetery, there is a monument, and it's to this man, George Bennet. Now, there he is. It's quite a grand monument, as you see it there, and it was put there sometime after he died by people who appreciated what he'd done. And you may notice that he's standing there and he's got his arm resting on a round thing. Can you see that? Like a ball. And that ball is a globe of the earth, basically, because of what he did, which I'll say in a moment. Now, that's what it looked like when it was built there almost 200 years ago. It isn't quite so good now. It looks like that now and is rather eroded. But it's still there, and it's got a magnificent inscription on the back to say what he did. And if you'd like to know, if you see a building there where I'm pointing, that's where your pastor had his important operation some time ago. That's the Hallamshire Hospital in Sheffield. Now, what did George Bennet do? George Bennet travelled around the globe to visit the missionary stations that have been set up by the London Missionary Society. This is way back now at the beginning of the 1800s. And the problem was they sent these missionaries abroad to many different countries, the LMS as we call it, but they had no contact with what was going on because there was no telephone, there was no post, there were only sailing ships, weren't even steamships. And to get across the other side of the globe took 6 months anyway. So there was no communication. So they asked George Bennet and the colleague if they would go and visit all the stations that they could. And that's what George Bennet did. And it says on the monument at the back there inscribed, in that period of time from 1820 to 1829, they were away for 9 years. They travelled 90,000 miles, which is an awful lot of distance to travel, almost entirely by ship, sailing, and on horses or donkeys or whatever you could find on land. And primarily, they visited the South Sea Islands, way out in the Pacific. And there are marvellous stories about what went on there, and I don't think I've told you that before, and I'm not going to tell you now either. I just wanted to mention one thing. After Bennet and his colleague had gone to the South Seas and they visited many, many islands, and many, many people were converted there actually through the missionaries' work, quite staggering numbers actually. He wanted, George Bennet, to go elsewhere. So they went to Australia, then they went to Indonesia, and then they went to China. And there was only one station in China, in the whole of China, that was allowed by the Chinese people in Guangzhou, or Canton. And so they sailed to Canton, hoping to meet the missionary, whose name was Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison had been there for quite a long time. He was dedicated to work amongst the Chinese. There was no other English-speaking missionary out there at this time. He was the only one. And he dedicated his life to being there. He was a brilliant linguist. He trained himself to be a doctor as well. Very ordinary background, basically. And incidentally, if any of you older people here have got a computer, well, you young ones have got computers, I know. Anybody who's got a computer, if you just type into there, Robert Morrison, you'll find on Wikipedia an excellent article about Robert Morrison. It's about 16 pages long, and it really is first rate, if you'd like to know a little bit more about him. Okay, so there he is in China. Robert Morrison arrives, so keen to meet this famous man, this translator of the Bible into Chinese. And he was so disappointed because Robert Morrison had left to go back to England. The only other time he did go, he went back to do various things, to actually present a copy of the Bible to the king, King George III, actually. And also he married when he was back home over here. So Bennet never met him. However, Bennet was a great collector of objects. He used to send all sorts of objects back to this country. And in Sheffield, we have some, which I've managed to locate, actually. And recently, very recently, I managed to get to this warehouse in Darnall in Sheffield, a pretty crummy area of Sheffield, really. And there they have some things that George Bennet actually sent back. And I've got photographs of these. And the young lady, was ever so helpful. And she got them all out of boxes from these shelves and undid them and so on, put them out on tables, and I took pictures of them. And then she said, "Oh, I've got something else," which I didn't know about. I said, "Would you like to see that?" She said, "Oh, yes, I'd like to see that." So she said, "Okay, I'll bring it out." And she produces this big box and takes things out, undoes them, and lays them out on the table. And I thought, I wonder what those are. And here they are laid out on the table. This is what they look like. So there are 8 things on a table. I've taken a photograph of them. Anybody like to guess what they might be? Sorry? Well, that's an excellent answer. They are indeed parts of the Bible. You're absolutely right. In fact, they are the whole of the New Testament split up into parts, starting from Matthew to the Gospels and along. It's the whole of the New Testament divided up into little thin booklets, effectively. And this is the very first translation of the Bible into the Chinese language. It was a huge undertaking, massive undertaking, but he did that and the Old Testament as well, and eventually, as I say, brought it home to the UK and presented a copy to the king. Now, I don't know about anybody here read Chinese. There's no way that I could read Chinese. So I told my son in London, David, who can actually do a little bit of Chinese. He can speak it and read a little bit of Chinese. So I sent this to him, and he was really excited when he saw this. He thought it was absolutely wonderful that this is actually there in Sheffield and so on. So he went on to, he showed the Chinese people in his church there, and he said, "Can you translate these things?" And they looked at them, they said, "Ooh, this is very difficult." But he also, my son, went onto the internet and found that he could get a complete copy off the internet of Morrison's Chinese Bible. The original Bible is available on the internet. And so he copied off the internet John's Gospel, my son did, and he gave it to the Chinese friend at the church who speaks Chinese and said, "Now," he said, "can you read this?" And they looked at him and they said, "Oh, this is so hard. This is so difficult, Chinese, to understand." And I think I know why, actually. because the article in Wikipedia, I've got a copy here, on the front shows two types of Chinese script. The first one is traditional Chinese, and the second one is simplified Chinese. And I think the answer for why our folk today can't read it is that this, Morrison's Bible, was in traditional Chinese, whereas people don't use that these days. It's the simplified form. And if you want to look afterwards, just have a look at the difference. There they are. Those are the two scripts. And if you look at them, you'll see why, man alive, how on earth does anybody cope with the traditional Chinese? It is amazingly complex and impossible to cope with. So no wonder they couldn't cope with it. So there's a little story about George Bennet of Sheffield visiting Robert Morrison out there in China.